Did the full title of the video register with you? The Evolution of the American Enemy, Chapter 4, Muslims. Well, for clarification's sake, chapters 1, 2, and 3 don't exist. They exist in full detail and color as part of American history, that's for sure, but not as isolated videos that concern this channel. So we're jumping right ahead into chapter 4 because that's what's relevant to us, Muslims. And what we're going to examine is how the United States, in order to historically achieve prosperity and continue along with its hegemony, it must constantly be in a state of potential conflict, facing adversity. Not necessarily with active and engaged wars, but a global standoff along civilizational lines. Keep in mind that the United States has never had a period of peace and tranquility for longer than 2 decades. And so the United States, as a self-conceived bastion of Western liberalism, continuously positions itself against contrasting others. At times, this enemy clearly exists, but in most, the other must be created and conditioned into the American psyche. Now, we're going to bypass the 18th and 19th centuries and dive straight into the 20th century American story, with its enduring us versus them strategy, when the baton would be handed over to the Muslims, who'd take their place as the next other, America's new enemy. Even though not totally important to our narrative, I still think it may be wise to share with you a quick synopsis on the first 3 chapters, only because it further demonstrates and strengthens the case for what followed, why and how the Americans needed to constantly reinvent their enemies. It all starts at the very beginning of the post-Columbian American story, with the natives on what was then the New World. Long before the calls for liberty crowned the American experiment, the earliest English colonies defined themselves against the people already rooted in the land, the pagans. Indigenous nations, Powhatan, Pequot, Wampanoag, and many others became the first other in the colonial imagination. To settlers, the continent was recast as empty wilderness, and its inhabitants as the savages who were positioned as obstacles to providence and expansion. Conflicts such as the Pequot War and King Philip's War hardened this mindset. In these early decades, the die was cast. The American identity formed not only through its shared ideals and goals, but through the stereotyping and dehumanization of those who stood beyond them. Centuries later, and as the perceived threat and populations of the Native Americans diminished, the colonies moved towards the age of revolution and enlightenment. The significant other during this era shifted across the Atlantic, towards the imperial Anglican British, whose rule was often framed not simply as political and economic domination, but symbolized the union of throne and altar. At the same time, American revolutionary leadership, including but not limited to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, had deep colonial suspicions of Catholic papacy, especially since the church and its systems conflicted with republican values. The Pope was often portrayed as a foreign monarch whose authority threatened political liberty. And so this sentiment and labeling of all non-Protestant religious powers, the Anglicans and the Catholics, would be amalgamated into the macro-level enemy creation narrative necessary to produce key victories such as the American Revolution, but also in vanquishing the old European empires of France, Great Britain, and Spain from across the Western Hemisphere. With the Europeans comprehensively gone and with American isolationism in full effect, America looked inwards to source its latest iteration of the other, the new enemy. From the late 19th century, a large influx of Jewish migrants fled European persecution to the United States, approximately 2.5 million Jews. During this 6-decade period from 1880, nativist politics in America were surging. And once the Jewish migrant level achieved perceptible recognition, the Jews were intentionally portrayed as outsiders, the enemy who threatened American culture, politics, and economic stability. Americans on all societal levels echoed anti-Semitic beliefs. John D. Rockefeller with his The International Jew Campaign, the Ku Klux Klan, as well as many other legislative and institutional enactments that either prejudiced against the Jews or barred them entirely from recognition. Now, one quick question I want to address before getting to the main point on how Muslims are the 4th iteration of enemy is, why not the communists? It's also a type of ideology. The Cold War lasted for 40 years, true. The communists were indeed an enemy. I guess one could add them, but the real continuous sequencing of the American enemy prototype needs to include a factor of religion and faith. American Christianity versus the other. And in the communists' equation, this element was absent. At this point, we're in the 20th century. Historical precedent existed with the clear-cut pattern of religious othering that was both continuous and contiguous, a strategy to repeatedly pinpoint an outsider, an enemy, the other. Call them what you want. By this time, much was happening across West Asia and North Africa. Nation-states were being created. Political promises, economic volatility, and societal maturity were unfolding. Yet, most importantly, sovereign wealth and resources were also being discovered in abundance, namely oil. And so, an area that was an empty quarter was now all of a sudden relevant, and even more so upon the introduction of the Jewish lobby. Everything poured into the region. The jockeying of foreign governments to seek natural resource concessions, the creation of a Zionist state in Arab lands, ideological push and pulls between communism and politicized Islam, and thus the seed of the Muslim as the enemy was planted. Within this moment, geopolitics gradually and steadily shaped the American psychological image of the Muslim world. What began as distant strategic engagement gradually hardened into a narrative in which Muslims were often cast as adversaries, mainly because Muslims were misunderstood on all fronts. The first turning point came with the discovery of vast petroleum reserves in the Arab region in the 1930s. American strategic planners quickly realized that energy resources would shape global power, and hence greed kicked in. In a response to the British, President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously acknowledged the region's geopolitical value, noting in 1944 that Persian oil is yours, the British. We share the oil of Iraq and Kuwait. As for Saudi Arabian oil, it's ours. This statement revealed how petroleum had already entered the strategic imagination of an imperial Washington. This was further reinforced by the CIA's removal of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 upon his nationalization of the oil industry. Thus, the overwhelmingly Muslim region became inseparable from the calculus of American power. Soon, another geopolitical force entered the equation: the creation of Israel. The founding of the Jewish state in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War placed the United States within a deeply emotional regional conflict. In American political discourse, the Arab and Muslim opposition to the Zionist colonial settler project was frequently framed not as an international law crisis, but as hostility to a God-given right and the Jewish faith in its entirety. This perception quietly fed an early cultural divide between Americans and Arab Muslim societies and has subsequently been infused with Zionist lobby narratives in the United States, as well as a comprehensive conditioning by Israel's Hasbara, further enforcing the enemy status. The decisive psychological rupture came in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. For Americans, images of crowds chanting against the United States and the subsequent Iran hostage crisis marked the first time a modern Islamic movement appeared to overthrow a pro-American order. In the American psyche, Islam began to appear not merely as a religion, but as a political threat. The final transformation came after the September 11th attacks. The strike carried out by Al-Qaeda embedded the idea of Islamic extremism directly into American domestic consciousness. In response to this event, President George W. Bush declared a global campaign stating, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there." Key words, does not end there.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
Conflicts such as the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, the Syrian conflict deepened the association between the Muslim world and security threats in American political discourse. The war on terror became the war on Islam. Yet there's a revealing paradox beneath this perception. The Muslim enemy in American imagination has largely been confined to oil-rich West Asia rather than the broader Muslim world. Countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Bangladesh, together home to hundreds of millions of Muslims, rarely appear in American enemy narratives. For many Americans, these societies scarcely register as part of the same civilizational category. To feed into the geopolitical agenda, we must highlight the notion of clash of civilizations. Islam in the common narrative is inherently incompatible with Western values such as democracy, secular governance, or gender equality. And in the United States, the more different you look, the more you stand out. This then triggers social anxiety, where the default might be either secular or Christian. And so, religious and cultural differences have played a central role in conditioning Americans to perceive Muslims as the other, a perception amplified through both political discourse and intellectual frameworks. The concept of a clash of civilizations, articulated by Samuel Huntington, argued that future conflicts would be driven less by ideology or economics than by cultural religious identities. Political leaders reinforced this approach. President Bush, addressing Congress after 9/11, asserted that the United States would fight a war against evil, against a radical network of terrorists, and against the regimes that harbor them. Though he avoided naming Islam as a whole, the language implicitly linked the faith with extremism and threat, reinforcing the perception of Muslims as a civilizational adversary rather than isolated political actors. Many authors and commentators have highlighted how media and cultural imagery shaped these perceptions. Bernard Lewis, the historian, warned in the 1990s that the gulf between Islam and the West is ancient, deep, and largely unbridgeable, a position that suggested incompatibility rather than geopolitical nuance, reinforcing the idea that Muslim identity itself was inherently oppositional. Through these intellectual and political lenses, Americans were conditioned to interpret religious practices, dress, social norms, and political activism in Muslim-majority countries as markers of an essential backwardness. In this sense, religious and cultural distinction was not merely descriptive, it became a tool of psychological conditioning, shaping public belief and foreign policy alike. I really do appreciate you taking the time and watching the Kennedy Chronicles. Please do join our community by subscribing so that you don't miss out on any content regarding the Arab and Muslim history, identity, and modern condition. And if you really do enjoy the channel week in and week out and would like to support us even further, please do join us at our YouTube membership program as well as on Patreon. Thanks again. The construction of Muslims as the enemy has long served as a tool for political opportunism in the United States. By identifying Muslims both abroad and at home as a source of threat, politicians can redirect public attention away from domestic problems and concentrate it on a tangible, identifiable enemy. Immigration debates, economic anxieties, and social unrest become easier to manage when they are linked to an externalized enemy. Muslim immigrants, for instance, are frequently cast in political rhetoric as potential security risks, as though the challenges of integration, employment, or crime are inherently connected to religious identity. Violent acts by Muslims are similarly exploited to magnify fear and justify broad policy measures. Following the attacks of September 11, leaders across the political spectrum framed Al-Qaeda not merely as a criminal network, but as emblematic of the Muslim world itself. By presenting jihad as the default constant aspiration of all Muslims, political narratives suggest that all Muslims exist within a continuum of potential danger, making it easier to mobilize public support for military interventions, surveillance programs, and restrictive immigration policies. And so misunderstood outgroups like Muslims are perceived as monolithic threats, enabling collective anxiety to be projected onto them. By portraying Muslims as an external and existential adversary, political actors simplify complex social and geopolitical problems into a narrative of moral conflict, ensuring that the enemy is not just visible, but indispensable to maintaining authority and cohesion. The labeling of Muslims as the enemy, led and amplified by the United States, is never truly about religion or culture in isolation. It's a strategic theater, a play designed to maintain global hegemony. Fear becomes a tool, suspicion a policy instrument, and the other a convenient scapegoat for everything else. It's not fair, nor is it just. It's calculated. Yet history shows the pattern as cyclical. Just as indigenous peoples, Catholics and Anglicans, Jews, and now Muslims have been cast as the other, so too will the focus shift when strategic necessity changes, when natural resources or geopolitical advantage lose their urgency. The current enemy will fade from attention, replaced by someone new, perhaps East Asian, or perhaps a reflection of America's own internal anxieties.